Welcome to Remedyforce Video Solutions, how to troubleshoot Remedyforce email services. In this video, we'll quickly identify the likely causes of email failing to process. We'll look at email forwarding problems, required fields, user access, field mapping, and email security settings. Let's first look at forwarding problems. If you send an email in and it's not processed into an incident, the most likely problem is that it wasn't forwarded correctly to the Salesforce email address. Most customers set up an email helpdesk@mycompany.com that forwards to the long email address of the Salesforce listener. What happens is someone will change the configuration on the mail server, Office 365, Exchange, whatever it happens to be, and it will stop forwarding to the Salesforce email address. It could also be a TLS configuration on the mailbox or some other such thing. But the easiest way to test this is to go to Email Services. So we're in the Remedyforce Admin tab, Configure Email, Email Services. I have the tab open. To go to your email listener, and you can have multiple email listeners, it'll work the same way for all of them. So click the email listener, then select one of the active email addresses and send an email directly to Salesforce. If the email, when sent directly to Salesforce, processes into an incident, then the issue is with the email, either the forwarding rule that forwards from helpdesk@mycompany.com to this long email address, or some of the TLS settings associated with the mailbox. So the way to determine if it's related to one of those two things is to just send an email directly to Remedyforce, and if it processes into an incident, then the problem is on the mail server side, not the Salesforce side. Next, required fields. Normally, this happens when someone added a field or changed a field setting on the actual object. So in this case, we'll go to Create, Objects, Incidents, and someone has forced one of the custom fields to be required. And when that happens, if it's not mapped, then the email won't process into an incident. So it'll be one of these fields under custom fields and relationships. The way to test that is to enable error logging on the email listener. And to do that, you can click Edit on the email listener, and you want to bounce message, enable error logging, and send to yourself or one of the admins. Click Save. If a required field is missing in the field mappings, the user will receive an email with an error message that says required field missing. Then you can go in and change the field permissions, and that'll fix that. Okay, the next thing we want to cover in the video is user access. It's important that the user associated with the mail listener, particularly the context user of the email address, this user right here, must have at least staff access and be active. A lot of times someone will come along needing to reduce the license count or not know what the user is, they'll deactivate the user. When that happens, the email listener will stop working. Another place that users have to be configured correctly in the email settings, if you go to Remedyforce, Administration, Configure Email, Incident Email Settings, is the user configured for errors, and the unidentified user must be active. If you have a user configured in either of these boxes, for here or for here, client for unidentified sender, they must be active users. If they're not active, the email will not process. Okay, next is field mapping. Oftentimes incidents will be created incorrectly or won't be created, and the mail admin believes that everything's configured correctly and should be mapped, and it doesn't come across. Well, that's when you check mapping email content to fields. I'm going to set up a test email. And we'll map some fields. Some things to check for. Number one, if you're mapping in the subject, I don't have any thing mapped in the subject. The first value here, if it contains a space, will be skipped. So sometimes that's a problem. So if you have, let's say we're putting impact in the body, and we had impact pound low pound, it would not process this impact, because instead of viewing impact here as the keyword, it views this whole string as a keyword, and you'll see over here there's not one. So you would want to make sure that if you're going to map on the first one, it's the first word and there are no spaces, otherwise it'll be skipped. I'm going to map a few real quick, and then we'll talk about some problems that you can. I have a few fields mapped, and we'll talk about some problems that can occur. So one would be the value doesn't exist. Here I'm mapping to the request definition field, and I'm looking for the request definition new user. If there's no new user request definition, then the email listener will just map the other fields and not populate this value. The next thing that can happen is the keywords are typed wrong. You'll notice here this is incident type, but I actually left out a T here. So it will not set the incident type, but will actually skip that value. Those are some things to look for. So if we were to send this in and allow it to create an incident, the only thing that would happen would be it would create an incident with impact and urgency low. The request definition field would be blank because I don't have a new user request definition, and the incident type service request would not map because the keyword is typed wrong. Finally, let's look at email security settings. If incidents aren't being processed in the email, one, it can be accept email from. So this setting may have a certain domain in it, like mycompany.com or even my email address. If that's the case, it'll only process incidents from that email address or from that email domain. The same is also true for the email addresses. They can be configured to only accept email from as well. So in this case, it's blank, which means it'll accept and try to process email sent from anyone. And then finally, there are some email configuration settings where TLS is required. So let's look at those. The main one is TLS preferred. So if you go to email administration, deliverability, if this TLS setting is set to required, then all inbound emails to and from Salesforce must have the TLS setting enabled. The preferred one is to set to preferred. That will allow email to be sent and received and processed. The other email setting that can cause problems, especially for the email conversation listener, is the org-wide email address. You want to make sure you have one available and verified, and that it's also configured correctly in the configure email conversation settings here. This concludes how to troubleshoot Remedyforce email services.